November 2nd, 1943, 05:43 hours. British 78th Division Field Hospital, Volturno Valley, Italy. Sergeant William Hartley pressed his fingers against the soldier's wrist and felt nothing. No pulse, no warmth. Just cold flesh beneath layers of frozen mud and blood-soaked wool. The private's lips had turned blue. His breathing came in shallow gasps, barely visible in the freezing air. Hartley reached for his medical pouch and pulled out a morphine syringe. Half a grain, standard dose. He broke the seal, pressed the needle into the man's arm, and squeezed. The metal tube collapsed. The morphine disappeared into tissue that felt like ice. Hartley was a combat medic with 3 years of service. He'd treated wounds in North Africa, Sicily, and now Italy. He'd seen men die from bullets, shrapnel, burns, and shock. He'd administered hundreds of morphine injections. He knew the protocols. He knew the dosages. He knew what worked, or thought he did. The temperature that morning was -2 degrees Celsius, the coldest November in Italian records. Across the Volturno Valley, where British and American forces were pushing toward the German defensive line, wounded soldiers lay in frozen foxholes, waiting for evacuation. Most had been there for hours, some for half a day. The cold had slowed their bleeding, but it had also slowed everything else. Their hearts beat slower. Their blood moved like syrup through constricted vessels. Their bodies had entered a state of suspended animation, hovering between life and death. Hartley didn't know that cold changes how morphine behaves in the human body. Nobody did. Not yet. The medical manuals said nothing about temperature and drug absorption. The training focused on wounds, bleeding, shock. Nobody had thought to consider what happens when you inject a drug into a man whose circulation has nearly stopped. By 0800, Hartley had treated 19 casualties. By 10:30, 37. Most arrived unconscious or barely responsive. Most showed signs of severe hypothermia. Hartley and the other medics worked frantically to stabilize them. They cut away frozen uniforms. They applied pressure bandages. They sprinkled sulfa powder on open wounds. And when the men showed signs of pain, when they groaned or thrashed or cried out, the medics administered morphine, 1 syringe, sometimes 2. The tubes were pinned to collars as markers. Do not give more. Protocol. The ambulances carried the wounded to the field hospital 3 miles behind the lines. Inside canvas tents, warmed by kerosene heaters, doctors and nurses prepared to receive them. The plan was simple. Warm them slowly, treat their injuries, stabilize them for transport to base hospitals. It had worked 1,000 times before. Nobody expected what was about to happen. Private David Mitchell was the first. He arrived at 11:15, transferred directly to the warming tent. His core temperature was 29 degrees Celsius, hypothermia. Severe but survivable. The nurses wrapped him in blankets and positioned him near a heater. His wounds were moderate, shrapnel to the shoulder and thigh, nothing life-threatening. He had 2 morphine syringes pinned to his collar, standard treatment. Within 30 minutes, his skin began to flush as circulation returned. Within 40 minutes, his breathing changed. It became slower, shallower. Within 50 minutes, his pupils contracted to pinpoints. Within an hour, he stopped breathing entirely. The crash call went out at 12:17. Medical Officer Captain James Reynolds ran to the warming tent. Mitchell's pulse was nearly undetectable. His skin had turned gray. His lips were purple. Reynolds couldn't understand it. The man's wounds weren't that severe. There was no bleeding, no pneumothorax, no apparent cause for respiratory failure. Reynolds administered atropine. He forced oxygen through a breathing apparatus. He worked for 12 minutes before Mitchell's heart responded. The private survived. Barely. But he remained unconscious, unresponsive, locked in a coma that Reynolds couldn't explain. 30 minutes later, it happened again. Corporal Thomas Brennan, same symptoms. Respiratory depression, pinpoint pupils, coma. Then again, Private Alan Whitaker. Then again, Sergeant Robert Hayes. By 1500, 7 soldiers had collapsed in the warming tent. All had been wounded in freezing conditions. All had received morphine in the field. All had nearly died, not from their injuries, but from something else, something invisible. Reynolds called an emergency meeting at 1600. 5 medical officers crowded into his tent. The pattern was undeniable. Soldiers arriving cold and relatively stable were collapsing as soon as they warmed up. The common factor was morphine. But the doses were standard. The syrettes were properly administered. The drug itself was supposed to be safe. Reynolds spread out the medical charts on a wooden table. Each one told the same story. Morphine administered in sub-zero temperatures. Patient stable during transport. Patient begins warming. Patient stops breathing. It was Captain Sarah Collins, a medical officer from Edinburgh, who first understood what was happening. She'd read a paper about drug absorption and circulation. She explained it in terms that made Reynolds' blood run cold. When you inject morphine into a man whose circulation has nearly stopped, the drug doesn't enter the bloodstream immediately. It sits in the tissue, trapped, waiting. The man feels no relief. The medic sees him still in pain and administers another dose, then another. Multiple syrettes accumulate in frozen flesh. And when that man finally reaches a warm hospital, when his body temperature rises and his circulation returns, all of that trapped morphine floods into his system at once. Not 1 dose, not 2 doses, but 3, 4, sometimes 5 doses hitting the bloodstream simultaneously. Enough to paralyze the lungs. Enough to stop the heart. If you're watching because you want to uncover more untold medical crises from World War II, stories of the catastrophic mistakes that revolutionized battlefield medicine, hit that subscribe button. We're documenting the moments when doctors discovered that sometimes the greatest danger came not from enemy fire, but from the protocols meant to save lives. The realization spread through the medical staff like a shockwave. Every wounded soldier who had received morphine in freezing conditions was now a potential time bomb. Every man warming in a hospital tent right now could stop breathing in the next 10 minutes. The crisis wasn't over. It had barely begun. Reynolds issued immediate orders. All patients who had received morphine in cold conditions were to be monitored continuously. Oxygen equipment at every bedside. Atropine prepared and ready. Breathing bags standing by. No patient was to be left unattended. But the orders came too late for some. By 1800, 3 more soldiers had collapsed. By midnight, the count had reached 17. The crisis wasn't limited to one hospital. Across the Fifth Army's operational area, the same pattern was emerging. At the 56th Evacuation Hospital, 12 soldiers fell into morphine-induced comas within 6 hours. At the 95th, 14. At the 15th, 9. Medical officers who had never met, who were separated by miles of frozen Italian countryside, were all seeing the same nightmare unfold. Soldiers surviving combat only to suffocate in the relative safety of their own hospitals. Sergeant Hartley learned about it at 2200. A runner arrived at his aid station with new orders. Do not administer morphine except for the most severe pain. Do not give multiple doses under any circumstances. Mark patients clearly if morphine has been administered in cold conditions. Warn receiving hospitals. The protocols that Hartley had followed for 3 years, the procedures he'd been trained to trust, had just proven themselves capable of mass casualties. He thought about the men he'd treated that day, 19 in the first 3 hours, 37 by noon. How many had received morphine? How many had received multiple doses because they were too cold to feel the first injection's effect? How many were lying in hospital tents right now, warming slowly, the drug accumulating in their bloodstreams like poison? Hartley had no way to know, no way to warn them, no way to take it back. Private Mitchell regained consciousness on November 6th, 4 days after his collapse. He had no memory of the coma, no understanding of what had nearly killed him. His wounds had healed, his lungs had recovered. But the 18 minutes he'd spent without adequate oxygen had left subtle damage. His memory would never be quite right. His concentration would falter. Small scars in the brain that would follow him for the rest of his life. The official count, compiled over the following 2 weeks, documented 187 cases of severe morphine poisoning across the Fifth Army's medical facilities. 187 soldiers who stopped breathing in hospital tents. 34 died. The rest survived only because medical staff, now alert to the danger, were able to intervene in time. But many of those survivors bore the marks of their ordeal. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Lung damage from prolonged respiratory depression. The invisible wounds that official records rarely acknowledged. The military medical establishment moved quickly to contain the crisis and prevent future occurrences. New protocols were drafted and distributed within days. Morphine was no longer to be administered routinely to wounded soldiers. It was to be used only for severe, intractable pain. In cold weather conditions, doses were to be reduced by half. No soldier was to receive more than 1 injection within 4 hours. Medical personnel were to be specifically trained to recognize delayed morphine poisoning. Most importantly, any patient who had received morphine in freezing conditions was to be treated as a high-risk case and monitored continuously during rewarming. If stories like this fascinate you, stories about the hidden crises that changed military medicine forever, make sure you're subscribed. We're building a collection of forgotten moments when battlefield doctors learned brutal lessons, when standard procedures proved deadly, and when the cost of progress was measured in the lives of men who trusted that medicine would save them. Sergeant Hartley continued his work as a combat medic until the war ended. He treated hundreds more casualties. He saved countless lives. But he never forgot November 2nd, 1943. He never forgot the realization that his hands, trained to heal, might have contributed to the crisis that nearly killed 187 men. He carried that knowledge for the rest of his life, a weight that no medal could balance, a burden that no commendation could ease. The morphine crisis of November 1943 became a classified medical study. The findings were documented in technical language, stripped of emotion, reduced to data and recommendations. The report concluded that environmental factors must be considered in all pharmaceutical interventions during combat operations. It was 47 pages long. It was marked secret. It remained classified for 28 years. When the report was finally declassified in 1971, few people noticed. The war had been over for a quarter century. The soldiers who had suffered were approaching their 50s, their medical records buried in archives. The medics who had treated them, who had unknowingly contributed to their suffering, had moved on with their lives or passed away. The lessons learned had been so thoroughly integrated into standard medical practice that their origin had been forgotten. But the knowledge remained in every military medical manual, in every combat medic's training, in every protocol that requires careful consideration of temperature, circulation, and environmental conditions before administering any drug. The knowledge remained because 187 soldiers nearly died, and 34 did die, teaching a lesson that medicine had to learn. The Volturno Valley is quiet now. The field hospitals are long gone. The frozen ground where wounded soldiers waited for evacuation has been reclaimed by 80 years of growth and change. Nothing marks the place where Sergeant Hartley worked through that terrible November day, where he followed protocols that would prove catastrophically flawed. Nothing except the protocols themselves, rewritten, refined, made safer by the suffering of men who had no choice but to trust that the medicine meant to save them wouldn't stop their hearts. Private Mitchell died in 1989, 46 years after the morphine crisis nearly killed him. He was 68 years old. His death certificate listed natural causes. It made no mention of the brain damage he'd sustained in an Italian field hospital. No reference to the 18 minutes his brain went without adequate oxygen, while doctors fought to restart his breathing. Those details existed only in classified medical files that his family never saw. The morphine syringe, that small aluminum tube that saved thousands of lives during World War II, was finally retired from military service in the 1970s. It was replaced by more modern delivery systems, by protocols that accounted for temperature and circulation, by training that emphasized caution over speed. The device itself became a museum piece, a relic of a time when battlefield medicine was learning its hardest lessons through the suffering of the men it was meant to protect. Sergeant Hartley never spoke publicly about the crisis. He returned to Manchester after the war, resumed his pre-war career as a pharmacist, raised a family, lived a quiet life. His war service was noted in his obituary in 1981. Decorated combat medic, served with distinction, saved countless lives. The obituary didn't mention the November day when the protocols he'd trusted had proven lethal. That part of his story remained classified even after the military documents were released. Some truths are too personal to be documented in official reports. But the lesson endures. In the architecture of modern battlefield medicine, in the protocols that now govern drug administration in extreme conditions, in the understanding that medicine is not a fixed science, but a constantly evolving practice, built on the accumulated knowledge of successes and failures, triumphs and tragedies. The 187 soldiers who fell into morphine-induced comas in November 1943 were not heroes. They were not volunteers in a medical experiment. They were simply casualties of war who happened to be wounded at a time when medicine didn't yet understand how cold weather could transform a life-saving drug into a deadly poison. Their legacy is written in the protocols that keep modern soldiers safer. In the training that teaches combat medics to consider environmental factors before reaching for their medical pouches. In the knowledge that what seems like standard procedure in one situation can become catastrophic in another. This is the invisible architecture of progress, built not on intentional innovation, but on accidental tragedy. Built on the bodies of men who trusted that the hands trying to save them knew what they were doing. The Volturno Valley morphine crisis killed 34 men and nearly killed 153 more. It revolutionized battlefield medicine's understanding of drug absorption and environmental factors. It led to protocols that have saved thousands of lives in the decades since. But the men who paid the price for that knowledge never knew they'd contributed to medical progress. They simply knew they'd stopped breathing in a place that was supposed to be safe. They simply knew that the medicine meant to ease their pain had instead stopped their hearts. And when they woke up, if they woke up, they carried the scars of that betrayal for the rest of their lives.